Welcome back to Pat Psychology Masters. Reached the end of week 5. It was another great week. This week I was focusing a lot on one of my assignments for my psychology research methods module, and my first assignment for this class, I had to pick 3 papers in the area of addiction in the young adult age group. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but with that in mind, this video is going to largely focus on psychology research methods and the differences between them. So, quick introduction to psychology research methods. Well, you've got 3 different types. You've got qualitative, you've got quantitative, and you've got mixed methods. So, they're kind of explanatory when you look at the word. So, qualitative research, so just a lot of words, you're getting the quality of somebody's experience there. So it involves interviews where people are telling their story about their subjective experience, and so it's quite a subjective area of research, in the sense that you want to get down to the bottom of how people are feeling and how they interpret what they're feeling. Be an area of research that, from a practical perspective, I'm particularly interested in, because I think pretty much all that matters about experience is how we experience it. But that's another topic for another day, my own interests. An equally important but distinct part of psychological research is quantitative research. So quantitative research is typically what we think of when we think of research. It generates a lot of numbers. We're getting, like in psychology, you'd be getting people's responses on a questionnaire, and you'd be, gathering how many people answered a particular way on the survey, and you'd be maybe relating that to another survey that they answered. So for instance, taking one of the research papers that I'm looking at for my assignment, they were looking at the mediating effects of drug use, identification with a peer group, so how you feel you belong in your group of friends, how much you feel that way, and then also it looked at psychological well-being. So I might give somebody a survey measuring their levels of drug use, another survey measuring their levels of peer identification, their sense of belonging, and another survey measuring their psychological well-being. And I might see how they relate to one another. Does somebody have an increased sense of psychological well-being if they're using drugs on a daily basis? If they are very involved in a peer group? How do these things relate to each other? And is, for instance, peer identification buffer between the effects of drug use and psychological well-being? Is there some mediating factor there? That's an example of quantitative research. And then you have the mixed methods approach, which mixes both qualitative and quantitative. And you'll find a lot of research today is a mix of the two. So for instance, you might be interested in assessing the use of tobacco-related products and cannabis-related products. So that was the research question of interest for a different paper I studied this week. It was looking at how do people who use both drugs, how do they use them? What's the relationship between the use? And they started off this research project by conducting interviews with people over the phone. And then from that, they analysed that data. They did what was called thematic analysis. So they analysed comparatively all the different interviews, and they picked out different themes which cropped up in each person's stories, in each person's opinions, in each person's experience. And then they used that to inform a questionnaire that they then developed, which they could disseminate to a much wider audience. So for things like, a theme that came up in the interviews was that smoking a cigarette reminds them of cannabis, or for instance, using cannabis was a way to reduce their tobacco use. So you could ask people, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree with this statement? I smoke cannabis to try and reduce my tobacco use. That's one example of a quantitative research question being used in a mixed methods study. And just for your own information, that type of scale that you see, 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, those scales are called Likert scales, and it's named after a famous scientist who first introduced them. getting back to the assignment at hand that I have this week, it's a critical analysis of those 3 different papers that I selected. So, as I mentioned, one was examining the co-use of tobacco and cannabis. The second paper was looking at the levels of identification a person has with a peer group, the amount of drugs they use, and also their psychological well-being. And the third paper I looked at was investigating the opinions of people in recovery from substance use disorders. So basically in recovery from addiction. It was looking for their opinions on how a college recovery program should be set up and seeing what their needs were. So that was a real example of pure qualitative research. So I'm going to take that to begin talking about the different forms of study and some of the limits that apply to them. With that study, they identified 2 participants who they knew would be relevant. So there were 2 people on campus. The study was conducted in Georgia, in the USA. So they noticed 2 prospective participants that were involved in launching a collegiate recovery program for substance use disorders. And they thought, they're 2 good participants. I'm going to get them involved in this study. I want to hear their opinions on what's needed for a collegiate recovery program and ask them how should it best be implemented. So they got their opinions and they asked these 2 participants to identify other people on the campus that could be involved in their study. So these 2 people went out, they got some more people for the study, and they in turn got more people for the study. So this method of gathering participants, it's called snowballing, the snowball method. I think it was a fairly controversial way to generate the sample for the study because it's going to largely be influenced and biased by the opinions of those first 2 people. Considering the fact they were involved in an attempt to launch a collegiate recovery program, well, it's likely that the people they recruited were familiar with that and they might have more favourable opinions about a collegiate recovery program than people who didn't know those 2 people. And it's also likely, or at least possible, that perhaps they had shared their ideas with one another and perhaps they all had similar ideas. And this possibly played out in that research because they interviewed 13 people, and after interviewing 13 people they found they reached what was called data saturation. But perhaps they only reached data saturation because they were getting the same opinion, or at least a similar opinion, 13 times, because it was from what's called a non-probabilistic sample. So a sample that is not necessarily representative of the wider community at large. To get a sample that would be representative of the wider community, you would have to use what's called a probabilistic method. This would involve, for instance, if you had a database of all the people in the area that suffer from a substance use disorder, you could perhaps break them into what's called strata. So people in certain age groups, let's say 40 to 60, 20 to 40, 10 to 20, in those ages. And you could break it down by race as well, and gender. And then, depending on the size of each of these strata, you could pick out proportional numbers of people from each strata, and then you would get what's called a representative sample of that whole population. The non-probabilistic method is a lot more convenient, but it's a lot less valid. So that was my main criticism of that study, that using that snowball sampling method, not a great way to get a fair opinion on a particular subject. So that's the qualitative research paper I looked at. The quantitative research paper I looked at was a Finnish study, and it was looking at the prospective mediating relationship between substance use, peer identification, as well as psychological well-being. They found that with the exception of alcohol, the use of any drug predicted a reduced score for identification with a peer group. In other words, alcohol, they found in the study, was the only drug which predicted increased identification with a peer group. Which seems interesting. Seems to be a beneficial aspect of consuming alcohol. you're going to identify with a peer group more, and it seems quite intuitive. I would say when I was reading that, I found it very interesting, and I proceeded to read the rest of the paper. There was a lot of issues with the paper. There was a lot of grammatical errors, simple grammatical errors. There was just some poorly written stuff. There was just, it seemed a bit off to me. And it just didn't seem like great science. At the end of the paper, they disclosed their funding information. And they were funded by a company called Alko, which is basically the sole distributor of alcohol to the public in Finland. And I thought, that's a happy coincidence that they found that alcohol is the only drug which increases identification with a peer group, so increases your sense of belonging to your friends. And I thought, maybe I should be a little bit skeptical of that finding considering their funding, because that discovery really suits the agenda and the business model of that company. And that's not to say that their findings weren't true, but I'm just a little bit more skeptical knowing that. Considering a lot of the errors that I found in this, from grammar, from lack of disclosure, in terms of not describing how they came to certain findings and how they designed certain tools and how they gathered certain data, it just reminded me of something that I don't think a lot of people realise. Just because something has been published in a scientific journal, that does not mean that it has to be taken as absolute gospel. Everything you read should be taken with a grain, if not a bucket of salt. It's so important to be skeptical. Even the best of scientists can get things wrong, and even the most reputable journals can publish something that's not true. And also, getting back to the fact that you shouldn't trust something just because it's in a scientific journal, there are journals which feature an option of pay to publish. So there are people out there who pay to have their research published. And it could be a peer-reviewed journal in name, but you have to question, is it a peer-reviewed journal in practice? Because I read that paper today. That wouldn't have passed through my eyes. I wouldn't have let it be published with the grammatical errors it had. So, along with all the other errors it had. So just, if somebody is telling you, I read it in a scientific paper, they could be telling you the truth, but maybe it's worth you assessing that scientific paper and judging it based off your own interpretations and seeing, well, did they really follow the scientific method? Did they describe how they came to their findings? Did the way they got their data, was it valid? Were the measures they used to get their data, were they used in many other studies? Taking this paper, for instance, again, they used a couple of well-validated measures, like the South Oaks gambling scale, which has been used in numerous studies to investigate gambling behaviour. They modified it for the Finnish context. But that's all they said. They just said they modified it. They didn't say how they modified it. They didn't say if they tested it for its validity after they modified it. So, maybe that's not that relevant anymore. They also assessed peer identification with a social group. I was expecting maybe something as complex as that would require quite a long questionnaire with many different questions, maybe asking what type of peer group you belong to, how long have you had what you consider your best friends, how often do you spend time with your friends. These kind of questions I was expecting to be asked. They asked one question: how much do you consider yourself identifying with the following? A peer group. And they had a 1 to 10 scale. That's all. That's all they asked. That question had never been asked in a previous research study. It hadn't been checked for validation if it actually converged on something meaningful. So, yeah, they're asking the question, but how valid is it? You have to think of these things when you're hearing about scientific literature and scientific research. The last study I'm going to tell you about investigated the co-use of tobacco and cannabis. As I mentioned previously, they started with a qualitative approach and they proceeded with a quantitative approach. They conducted interviews with numerous people in asking them about their use of both drugs, what context they use both drugs in, how did one drug affect the other, how did one drug make them feel if they used it by itself, if they used it with the other drug, do they mix the drugs, etc, etc. And they got a wealth of data. It was very, very interesting. And then once they analysed all the data from these interviews, which they transcribed and then read through and used different software packages to help them code the data, they then conducted a more quantitative study by developing a questionnaire for tobacco's co-use with cannabis. This is part of a much larger parent study investigating the relationship between the two. And from another study under this parent study of investigating the relationship between tobacco and cannabis, they used that data to inform their development of this questionnaire. That study was the most interesting study I looked at. I'm going to provide links to all the studies in the description below. If you want to check them out for yourself, you should. See if you come to similar conclusions about their validity as I have. And remember, stay skeptical. It's very, very important. If you want to have a scientific frame of mind, the number one philosophy I think is important is that of skepticism. So thank you very much for watching my video talking about psychological research, which was a very, very brief insight into the topic. Remember to like the video if you liked it, hit dislike if you disliked it, and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos. Thank you very much.